The infrared camera caught it first. A heat signature that shouldn't exist, moving through the Hindu Kush at an altitude where oxygen becomes a luxury and helicopters struggle to maintain lift. The Joint Operations Center in Bagram fell silent as the thermal bloom pulsed across their screens, too large for a single aircraft, too coordinated for anything commercial. Major Kendrick leaned forward, coffee forgotten. "Get me AWACS confirmation." The response came through encrypted channels within 90 seconds. 3 aircraft, no transponders, no flight plan, moving toward the Pakistani border with the kind of precision that made career intelligence officers nervous. Outside, the April wind carried dust devils across the tarmac, and somewhere in that maze of mountains, 8 Navy SEALs had gone dark 40 minutes ago during what should have been a routine extraction. Their last transmission was 2 words: going deeper. The operations room smelled like burnt coffee and the particular anxiety that comes when good people disappear into bad geography. Captain Reyna, Revenant Marchenko stood against the back wall, arms crossed, watching the thermal feed with eyes that had seen worse nights than this. At 34, she carried herself with the economy of movement that came from logging over 2,000 combat hours in the cockpit of an MH-60M Black Hawk. Her call sign had nothing to do with death, despite what the new arrivals assumed. It came from a mission over Helmand Province where she'd brought a shot-to-hell helicopter home on a prayer and one functioning engine, the kind of flying that should have ended in a fireball but instead became a legend whispered in ready rooms. The brass had wanted to ground her for recklessness. The crew chief she'd saved bought her a drink and told everyone she flew like something that refused to stay dead. "Thoughts, Captain?" Kendrick didn't turn around, but everyone in the room knew he was talking to her. There was a particular tone superior officers used when they wanted expertise but were prepared to ignore it. She'd heard it her entire career. Reyna studied the screen, watching the ghost signatures weave through valleys that had killed better pilots than most people would ever meet. The movement pattern was wrong, too aggressive for search and rescue, too coordinated for anything improvised. "Those aren't lost," she said quietly. "They're hunting." "Hunting what?" "Or protecting something." She pushed off the wall, stepping closer to the display. "Sir, those signatures are moving in a combat air patrol pattern, racetrack circuits with overlapping coverage. Someone's running top cover." She traced the pattern with her finger, not touching the screen. "Our SEALs aren't missing. They're being guarded." The room temperature seemed to drop 5 degrees. Kendrick's jaw tightened. "By whom?" Reyna met his eyes. "By someone who knows they're coming out hot." 20 miles away, in a valley where the stars burned cold and ancient, the sound of rotors echoed off stone walls that had witnessed empires crumble. But the operations center couldn't hear that yet. They could only watch the heat signatures dance and wonder what kind of pilot flew without fear in mountains that ate helicopters for breakfast. The senior controller, a lieutenant colonel with more combat deployments than most people had birthdays, finally spoke what everyone was thinking. "We need assets airborne, now." His hand hovered over the comm switch. "Who do we have on standby?" The answer came from the duty roster, cold and bureaucratic. 2 Apache gunships, crew rest compliant. 1 Chinook heavy lifter with a maintenance hold. And parked at the far end of the flight line, under lights that hummed and flickered, 1 specially modified MH-60M that most pilots called unflyable after its last mission left it with battle damage the depot-level maintenance couldn't completely erase. The airframe was technically operational. The flight characteristics were anyone's guess. "Revenant's bird," someone muttered. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an observation about the only aircraft that could possibly get airborne in the next 15 minutes, and the only pilot crazy enough to fly it into conditions that made seasoned aviators check their life insurance. Kendrick turned slowly. "Captain Marchenko, how's your aircraft?" Reyna didn't hesitate, angry and mean, like everything else worth flying. She was already moving toward the door. "I'll need a co-pilot who doesn't ask stupid questions and a crew chief who knows how to clear a jam with a hammer and a prayer." You're not going alone. I'm not planning to, sir. She paused at the threshold. But I'm also not waiting for a committee to decide if my brothers are worth the risk. The door swung open to the night air, cool and smelling of jet fuel. I'll be wheels up in 12 minutes. If you have orders, get them to me before then. If not, I'll write my own. The thing about Raina Marchenko that made her simultaneously invaluable and infuriating was her absolute inability to accept impossible as an answer. She'd grown up in a Montana town, so small it didn't appear on most maps, raised by a grandmother who'd flown crop dusters until she was 70, and a father who'd taught her that fear was just information, not instruction. The Army had wanted to make her transport pilot. She'd volunteered for combat aviation and scored high enough on the evaluations that they couldn't say no without admitting bias. 3 deployments later, she had a chest full of medals she never wore and a reputation that preceded her like thunder before lightning. The flight line was alive with organized chaos. Ground crews moved with practiced efficiency, pulling chocks and running final checks on aircraft that might not come home. Chief Warrant Officer Darius Wade was already in the left seat when Raina climbed aboard, his dark hands moving across pre-flight checks with the confidence of someone who'd logged almost as many hours as she had. They'd flown together for 18 months. He knew better than to ask if she was sure about this. "Systems?" she asked, settling into her seat and pulling on her helmet. "Everything works that's supposed to work. Everything else is character building." Wade's Louisiana drawl made even bad news sound like a fishing story. "Hydraulics are good. Engines are solid. That vibration at 80 knots is still there. The one that feels like the tail rotor wants to visit another aircraft." "That's the one." Raina cycled the collective, feeling the helicopter respond beneath her. The MH-60M was a beautiful, complicated beast, all sharp angles and aggressive capability. This particular airframe had a history: bullet holes patched with speed tape and prayer, wiring harnesses that had been rerouted so many times the technical manuals were more suggestion than fact. She loved it the way some people loved broken things that refused to quit. "Tower Revenant 11, ready for departure instructions." The response crackled through her headset with the kind of professional calm that barely masked urgency. "Revenant 11, you're cleared for immediate departure. Fly heading 270, climb and maintain flight level 150. Contact AWACS on Victor." A pause. "Good hunting, Captain." "Copy all." She brought the engines to full power, feeling the turbines spool up with a rising whine that drowned out doubt. The helicopter shuddered, lifted, and translated forward into the darkness with the kind of authority that came from thousands of hours and zero hesitation. Behind them, the operations center watched their infrared signature join the dance of ghosts in the mountains. Wade was already cycling through frequencies, establishing contact with the orbiting AWACS aircraft that was painting the airspace with radar pulses. "Overlord, Revenant 11 checking in as fragged heading 270, climbing through Angels 8. Revenant 11, Overlord has you painted. Be advised, 3 unknowns holding racetrack pattern vicinity grid Papa Quebec 7342. No IFF, no comms. Rules of engagement remain weapons hold unless fired upon." The AWACS controller's voice was Texas flat and professional. "Your package is 12 miles north of unknown positions. No comms for 47 minutes. 12 miles in mountain terrain might as well be 1,200. Raina adjusted course slightly, threading between peaks that rose like broken teeth against the stars. The night vision goggles turned the world into shades of green phosphor, painting the landscape in alien beauty. Snow on distant peaks glowed like foxfire. Villages showed as clusters of heat blooming in valleys. And ahead, barely visible even on thermals, 3 aircraft moved with purpose that suggested military training and complete disregard for international aviation protocols. "What do you think?" Wade asked quietly. They were 15 minutes from the last known position of the SEAL team, flying through airspace that belonged to people who shot first and never bothered with questions. Friendly, unfriendly, aggressively neutral. Reyna watched the unknown signatures adjust their patrol pattern, tightening slightly as if acknowledging her approach, professional, disciplined, not the behavior of smugglers or insurgents with stolen helicopters. I think someone's about to have a very interesting conversation. She keyed the common tactical frequency, knowing it was monitored by everyone with ears and bad intentions. Unknown aircraft vicinity grid Papa Quebec 73. This is coalition forces on approach. State intentions. Static, then cutting through the white noise like a blade, a voice with an accent that could have been anywhere from Islamabad to London via Moscow. Coalition aircraft, recommend you maintain current heading. The night is busy. That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're receiving. The voice carried a smile Reyna couldn't see but could hear. Fly safe, Revenant. The mountains remember everyone. The use of her call sign made Wade's hand drift toward his weapon. Nobody should know who they were. The mission had been scrambled too fast for intelligence leaks, too urgent for the usual security compromises, which meant the unknowns had been listening, watching, and planning for longer than anyone in Bagram realized. Reyna felt the familiar cold clarity that came before violence. We've got a problem. Multiple problems, Wade corrected, pointing at his display. Those unknowns just shifted formation, their positioning for intercept. The night, which had been merely dangerous, suddenly became lethal. The MH-60M wasn't built for air-to-air combat. It was a utility helicopter dressed up with guns and good intentions, meant to insert soldiers and extract them when everything went sideways. The unknown aircraft ahead were moving with the kind of precision that suggested dedicated attack platforms or pilots with more training than sense. Reyna dropped altitude, skimming closer to the ridgeline, using the terrain to mask her approach. The helicopter shuddered as she pushed it through turbulence that would have made commercial pilots retire. Overlord Revenant 11 requesting immediate backup. 3 unknowns are maneuvering for intercept. She kept her voice level professional, the tone that said this was just another Tuesday in the mountains of death. Also requesting positive ID on these contacts. Revenant Overlord, be advised, unknowns are not squawking any known friendly codes. Architecture suggests Russian or Chinese manufacture, but configuration is non-standard. Translation. Someone had spent serious money making these aircraft invisible to the databases that every intelligence agency in the world contributed to. Nearest QRF is 23 minutes out. 23 minutes was approximately 22 minutes longer than they might have. Reyna jinked left as tracer fire lit up the night, green streams arcing past her canopy with the lazy beauty of something designed to kill. Not aimed at her. Warning shots, placed with the accuracy that said whoever was shooting could hit if they wanted. Apparently someone wants to talk, she said, spinning the helicopter through an aggressive brake that made the airframe groan. The radio crackled again. Same voice, same almost friendly tone. Revenant, you're very good, but this airspace is complicated tonight. Your SEALs are safe. Let them finish their work. Their work? Reyna brought the helicopter to a hover behind a ridgeline, using the mountain as cover. Below, her thermal imaging showed a village, dark and quiet, with heat signatures that suggested life but not military presence. What work? The kind that prevents wars instead of starting them. The kind that certain governments would prefer to ignore until bodies start stacking. A pause. You want your men back. Give them 30 minutes. Then everyone goes home. You have my word. Wade was cycling through weapons checks, his movements automatic but tense. We taking deals from unknown hostiles now. Do we have a choice? Reyna studied the tactical display. 3 aircraft between her and the SEALs. Unknown capabilities, unknown intent, but demonstrated ability to engage. Her helicopter was tough but not invincible. And somewhere in those mountains, 8 men were counting on someone to make the smart call instead of the heroic one. Unknown aircraft. I need confirmation my team is secure. Stand by. The voice went silent. Then, cutting through on a different frequency, she heard something that made her heart rate drop and her breath catch. An American voice, tired and professional. Revenant Dagger 2-6. We're secure and mission complete. Do not repeat, do not engage the overhead assets. They're providing security. It was the SEAL team leader, using authentication codes that checked against the database. Alive, operational, and telling her to stand down. Reyna processed this in the 2 seconds it took her brain to catch up with implications. Dagger 2-6, authenticate Mike Bravo 7 Foxtrot. November Hotel 3 X-ray. It's really me, Revenant. The situation is non-standard but controlled. Non-standard was military speak for something so far outside normal operations that the phrase, technically not a war crime, might eventually be relevant. Reyna made a decision that would either end her career or define it. Overlord, Revenant 1-1. Package is secure and authenticated. Request permission to hold position and provide overwatch. The silence from AWACS was deafening. Then, with the weight of rank and responsibility, Revenant, permission granted. Monitor and report. Do not repeat, do not engage unless fired upon. So she waited, hovering in the darkness, rotors chopping through thin air, while below her men she would die for completed whatever classified nightmare had brought them to this particular piece of hell. The unknown aircraft continued their patrol, professional and distant, and somewhere in Bagram, officers were having conversations that would eventually require congressional hearings and executive orders. The minutes crawled. Wade monitored systems, compensating for the damage that made the helicopter fly like it was personally offended by physics. Reyna watched the thermal display and thought about choices, consequences, and the particular burden of knowing when violence wasn't the answer. At 28 minutes, the first SEAL appeared on her thermal, moving down the mountain with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this too many times to count. Then another. Then all 8, moving in tactical formation with something between them that read as a heat signature wrapped in insulation. A person. No, 2 people. Small frames. Children. The realization hit her like turbulence. They weren't conducting a raid. They were running a rescue. The unknown aircraft banked away, one by one, disappearing into the night with the same ghost-like precision they'd arrived with. No goodbye, no explanation, just the cold mathematics of people who understood that some operations transcended politics and flag colors. The radio crackled one last time. Safe skis, Revenant. Perhaps we'll meet again in better circumstances. Then silence, broken only by the sound of her rotors and Wade's quiet observation. Well, that was aggressively weird. Reyna was already maneuvering for pickup, dropping into the valley with aggressive certainty. The SEALs had marked their position with an infrared strobe, invisible to the naked eye but bright as noon on her goggles. She brought the helicopter into a hover, rotors whipping snow and dust into whirlwinds, while the team loaded with practiced efficiency. 2 children, wrapped in thermal blankets, eyes wide with shock but alive. 8 SEALs, tired and bloody but functional. And as the last man climbed aboard, the team leader pulled off his helmet and met her eyes with an expression that said this conversation would happen later, in private, with whiskey. They flew back to Bagram in silence. The children slept, exhausted beyond fear. The SEALs conducted weapons maintenance with hands that had done terrible things in service of necessary outcomes. And Reyna flew her angry, broken helicopter through mountains that had killed better people, thinking about the ghosts who'd protected her brothers, and wondering what kind of world required such complicated heroism. The debrief lasted 7 hours. Classified rooms, tired officers, and questions that had no good answers. The children were assets, the offspring of a high-value intelligence target who'd offered cooperation in exchange for their safety. The SEALs had extracted them from a village where their father's enemies were closing in. The unknown aircraft had been a combination of cooperative intelligence services that officially didn't exist, providing security for an operation that couldn't be acknowledged. International law was a complicated fiction, and sometimes good people did questionable things in service of preventing worse outcomes. Raina gave her report with the clinical precision of someone who understood that her career hinged on saying the right words in the right order. Yes, she made contact with unknown aircraft. No, she hadn't engaged. Yes, the SEAL team had authenticated properly. No, she couldn't identify the protecting aircraft beyond what she'd already stated. The debriefers took notes, exchanged looks, and eventually dismissed her with the understanding that some things were better left unexamined. She found the SEAL team leader in the transient quarters, cleaning weapons with the methodical focus of someone who used routine to process trauma. Master Chief Aaron Kelleher had the kind of face that had seen too much and decided to keep looking anyway. He glanced up as she entered, nodded once, and went back to his rifle. "You didn't shoot." "You told me not to." Not everyone listens. He field-stripped the Bolt Carrier group with hands that didn't shake despite having every reason. "Those kids would be dead if you decided to play hero. Their father is going to give us intelligence that saves thousands of lives. And those unknown aircraft you didn't engage. They were flown by allies who can't be allies officially, but understood the mission mattered more than politics." Raina sat down on a footlocker that had been to more countries than most people would visit in a lifetime. "So what do I tell the next new pilot who asks why we don't shoot at unknowns?" "You tell them that some nights the right thing looks wrong until you see the whole picture." Kelleher reassembled his weapon with clicks of metal that sounded like punctuation. "You flew smart tonight, aggressive enough to show you weren't scared, professional enough to not start a war. That's why your call sign fits. Revenant. Something that should be dead but refuses to quit." He smiled without humor. "You kept flying after Hellman when other pilots would have transferred to transports. You brought a shot-up bird home tonight when most people would have diverted to safety. And you made the hard call when violence would have been easier." He met her eyes. "The SEALs remember their friends, Captain. You ever need something, you call. We'll be there." It was the kind of currency that couldn't be spent but meant everything. Raina nodded once, stood, and walked out into the dawn that was breaking over Afghanistan with the relentless optimism of sunrise, indifferent to the darkness that preceded it. The months that followed were quietly remarkable. Raina flew missions that became footnotes in classified reports. She trained new pilots who sometimes listened and often learned. Her helicopter, the angry MH-60M that refused to die properly, became a legend among crew chiefs who understood that some aircraft developed personalities that transcended engineering. And occasionally, on frequencies that weren't officially monitored, she'd hear the echo of that voice from the mountains, acknowledging her presence with professional respect that transcended nationality. The brass never quite knew what to do with her. Too competent to dismiss, too independent to promote into positions where conformity mattered. She made lieutenant colonel through sheer accumulation of combat hours, and a recommendation from a SEAL team that carried weight in circles where competence mattered more than politics. The promotion came with a transfer to Fort Campbell, and a position training the next generation of combat aviators, who would fly into places where death was patient and mountains were unforgiving. She took the job because someone had to teach the kids that bravery without intelligence was just creative suicide, and that sometimes the hardest thing to do was not pull the trigger. Her lectures were different from the standard curriculum. She talked about fuel calculations and rotor limits, but also about judgment, consequence, and the moral weight of flying machines that could kill with casual efficiency. Some students thought she was soft. Those students usually washed out. The ones who understood became the kind of pilots that other pilots wanted on their wing when the night got complicated. There was a particular afternoon, autumn bleeding into Tennessee with colors that reminded her of Montana, when a student asked the question she'd been waiting for. "Ma'am, have you ever not fired when you should have?" The classroom went silent. 20 faces, young and eager and still innocent of what violence actually cost. Raina looked at them and saw herself at their age, before deployments and decisions and the particular exhaustion that came from carrying dead friends in your memory. I've not fired when I could have. That's different. She stood, walked to the window, watched helicopters run patterns over Kentucky Lake. The hardest shots are the ones you don't take. Anyone can pull a trigger. It takes judgment to know when the trigger isn't the answer. But what if you're wrong? Then people die and you carry that. She turned back to face them. But if you shoot too soon, people still die and you carry that too. The difference is whether you acted with intelligence or fear. One of those you can live with, the other eats you from inside. A hand raised. Young warrant officer, fresh from flight school, with the kind of earnest intensity that hadn't been tempered by reality. How do you know which is which? Experience, training, and accepting that sometimes you won't know until years later. Raina pulled up a map on the display, showing terrain that some of them would eventually fly over in anger. Let me tell you about a night in the Hindu Kush when I didn't shoot, and why 8 SEALs and 2 children came home because of it. She told them the story, leaving out the classified details but keeping the moral complexity. They listened with the focus of people who understood this wasn't just theory anymore. When she finished, the silence was thoughtful rather than uncomfortable. The warrant officer who'd asked the question nodded slowly. So sometimes the enemy isn't the enemy. Sometimes the enemy is the situation, and you're all just trying to survive it. Raina dismissed the class with a reminder about their night navigation practical and watched them file out, already arguing about decisions and ethics, and whether they'd have the courage to not shoot when shooting would be easier. She hoped they never had to find out. She hoped they all would, because that meant they'd survived long enough to face hard choices. The years accumulated like flight hours. Raina made full colonel through a combination of competence and the kind of recommendations that came from people who didn't write recommendations lightly. She commanded a battalion, trained thousands of pilots, and became the kind of officer that senior leaders called when they needed someone who could think beyond doctrine. Her call sign followed her, morphing from nickname to legacy. New pilots learned about Revenant before they met her, heard stories that grew with each retelling but maintained the core truth. She was the pilot who'd flown the unflyable and made the impossible look routine. There was a ceremony at Fort Campbell, something about career achievement and distinguished service, with speeches that managed to be both sincere and bureaucratically necessary. The division commander, a 2-star general who'd come up through armor before pivoting to aviation, stood at a podium and said things about dedication and excellence that were true enough to avoid being entirely hollow. Colonel Marchenko represents the finest traditions of Army aviation. Her combat record speaks for itself. Her training legacy will continue for generations. He paused, looked directly at her. But what defines her career isn't the mission she flew. It's the judgment she demonstrated when not flying would have been easier. The audience, a mix of pilots and senior officers and people who'd served with her, understood he was talking about something specific without saying it directly. That was how the military worked. Important truths wrapped in acceptable language, leaving the initiated to decode meaning from careful phrasing. Raina accepted the award, a piece of metal and ribbon that would go in a box with the others, and gave a speech that was shorter than expected and more honest than comfortable. I've been lucky. Lucky to fly with good people, lucky to make hard choices that worked out, lucky to survive when others didn't. She looked at the faces watching her, seeing her younger self repeated in their expressions. The only advice I have is this: train hard, think harder, and remember that the hardest trigger to not pull is sometimes the most important one. They applauded politely. Some understood. The rest would eventually if they survived long enough. The party afterward was held at a bar near post that catered to aviation types, with memorabilia covering walls and music loud enough to prevent serious conversation. Raina found herself at a table with old crew members, people who'd shared cockpits and close calls, and the particular intimacy that came from trusting someone with your life. Darius Wade was there, now a Chief Warrant Officer 5 with enough time in service to have strong opinions about everything. He raised a beer in salute. To Revenant, still refusing to die properly. To everyone who came home, Raina corrected, and they drank to that instead, because some traditions mattered more than individual recognition. The conversation drifted through memory and gossip, and the kind of technical arguments that only mattered to people who flew helicopters professionally. Someone mentioned the new MH-60M variants coming online, with upgraded engines and better avionics and flight characteristics that supposedly fixed all the problems the old birds had. Wade snorted. "They'll be boring. Give me an aircraft with personality." "You mean one that tries to kill you?" "If it's not trying to kill you, you're not flying it right." He grinned, then grew serious. "You hear about Kelleher?" Raina hadn't. Master Chief Aaron Kelleher, the SEAL she'd extracted from the Hindu Kush that complicated night, had retired after 26 years and more combat deployments than most people accumulated traffic tickets. He'd moved to Montana, coincidentally near the town where Raina had grown up, and was teaching high school kids about leadership and making hard choices. They exchanged Christmas cards, the kind of quiet connection between people who'd shared something important without needing to discuss it constantly. "He's good." "Better than good. Apparently he's got a whole program teaching kids about decision-making under pressure, uses that night as a case study." Wade refilled his beer from the pitcher. "Calls it the Revenant Protocol. Make the smart call instead of the easy one." The name made her uncomfortable in the way recognition always did. Raina had never sought attention, had actively avoided it when possible, but understood that some stories took on lives of their own regardless of the original participants' preferences. As long as it keeps kids from doing stupid things. It does more than that. Wade pulled out his phone, showed her a news article about Kelleher's program that had been featured in some educational journal. He's teaching them that heroism isn't always action. Sometimes it's restraint. Sometimes it's waiting for better information before committing to violence. He pocketed the phone. "You changed how he thinks about leadership. He's passing that forward." The weight of legacy settled over her like weather. Raina had spent 23 years in uniform, flying missions that were sometimes remembered and often classified. She trained hundreds of pilots, made thousands of decisions, and accumulated a record that would be studied by people analyzing what worked and what didn't. But this, the idea that a single night had created a teaching framework that might prevent stupid decisions, felt more substantial than any award or promotion. "I just didn't shoot. That's not revolutionary." "It is when everyone else would have." Wade's Louisiana drawl softened with rare seriousness. "You gave those SEALs and those kids a future. You prevented an international incident. You demonstrated that intelligence matters more than firepower. That's worth teaching." The bar noise swelled around them. Pilots arguing about approach angles and crew chiefs defending maintenance decisions, and the eternal debates about which airframe was superior. Raina listened to it with the fondness of someone who understood this was her tribe. These were her people, and this particular subculture had given her everything that mattered. The night wound down eventually, as nights do, with tired goodbyes and promises to stay in touch that would be partially kept. She drove back to her quarters through Tennessee darkness, past the airfield where helicopters sat silent on the line, and thought about inheritance. Her grandmother had taught her to fly in crop dusters over Montana wheat. Her father had taught her that fear was just information. The Army had taught her violence, discipline, and the weight of responsibility. And somewhere in mountains half a world away, on a night when she'd chosen intelligence over instinct, she'd learned that sometimes the most important thing a warrior could do was refuse to fight. The lesson seemed worth passing forward, so she continued teaching, year after year, training pilots who would fly into harm with competence and judgment. Some of them would face their own complicated nights, their own moments where the easy answer was wrong and the right answer was hard. She hoped they'd remember her lectures. She hoped they'd make smart choices. She hoped they'd come home. Retirement came eventually, with more ceremony than she wanted and less fanfare than others received. Colonel Raina Marchenko, United States Army, retired after 28 years of service that read like a greatest hits compilation of places where people shot at helicopters. The speeches were kind. The awards were numerous. The send-off involved the traditional final flight, circling Fort Campbell one last time in an MH-60M that wasn't her original bird, but carried the same spirit of aggressive functionality. She landed on the parade field to applause, shut down the engines with hands that had performed the same task thousands of times, and walked away from the aircraft with the understanding that this chapter was complete. Montana welcomed her home with autumn colors and big sky that made Tennessee feel claustrophobic in retrospect. She bought a small place near where she'd grown up, close enough to town for convenience but far enough for solitude. The locals remembered her as the girl who'd left for the army and come back with colonel's eagles and a reputation. They were polite about it, Montana polite, which meant respecting her privacy while being genuinely pleased she'd returned. Some mornings she'd see Kelleher at the local diner, and they'd share coffee and newspapers without needing to discuss the night that connected them. The understanding was sufficient. She taught occasionally at the community college, guest lectures on leadership and decision-making that drew students and veterans and people curious about what 28 years in uniform actually taught someone. Her approach was different from academic instructors. She used case studies from real operations, scrubbed of classified details, but retaining moral complexity. The students responded to authenticity, asking questions that suggested they understood these weren't theoretical exercises. And sometimes, when the discussion got philosophical, she'd tell them about judgment, restraint, and knowing when violence wasn't the answer. Winter came hard to Montana that year, the kind of cold that made breath visible and reminded people that comfort was something you built rather than expected. Raina spent evenings reading, working through the stack of books she'd accumulated during years when deployment schedules made long-form reading impossible. She reconnected with friends from before the Army, people who'd taken different paths, but shared the same essential DNA of stubbornness and independence. And she flew occasionally, renting aircraft from the local airport, taking up small planes for the pure joy of being airborne without mission requirements or tactical considerations. The phone call came on a February afternoon when snow was falling with the gentle persistence of something that planned to continue for days. Unknown number, which she almost didn't answer, but something made her accept the call. The voice on the other end was familiar despite years and distance. Colonel Marchenko, this is Captain Vega. We haven't met, but I flew with Master Chief Kelleher before he retired. How can I help you, Captain? Professional courtesy, even in retirement. I'm coordinating a program for young aviators, teaching advanced decision-making in combat situations. Master Chief suggested you might be willing to participate as an instructor. Vega had the kind of voice that suggested youth tempered by experience, someone who'd seen enough to know what they didn't know. We're specifically focusing on judgment under pressure, using real-world examples of choosing restraint over action. Raina looked out her window at Montana winter, at landscape that had shaped her before the Army refined the edges, and considered the request. Teaching had always been important to her, the idea that competence should be passed forward rather than hoarded. What's the program? 3 weeks, Fort Rucker, mixed audience of Army, Air Force, and Allied pilots. We're calling it the Advanced Judgment Course. Real scenarios, no simple answers, emphasis on thinking instead of reacting. A pause. Your operation in the Hindu Kush is one of our primary case studies. It would mean more coming from you. The operation that refused to fade, that kept echoing through years and distance, finding new relevance in contexts she hadn't anticipated. Raina made a decision that felt inevitable. I'll do it. Send me the details. Thank you, Colonel. This matters more than you might realize. She suspected she realized exactly how much it mattered. The students who learned to think before shooting would become the leaders who made policy instead of just executing it. They'd carry forward the understanding that violence was a tool, not an answer, and that sometimes the hardest choice was the most important one. The course at Fort Rucker ran through March, when Alabama was deciding whether to be winter or spring and settling for uncomfortable compromise. Raina taught alongside active duty instructors who were uniformly professional and occasionally brilliant. The students were captained through lieutenant colonel rank, experienced enough to understand complexity, but junior enough to still be shaped by good instruction. She watched them wrestle with scenarios that had no right answers, only varying degrees of wrong, and saw herself in their frustration and eventual understanding. Her lecture on the Hindu Kush operation was scheduled for the second week. She prepared extensively, building a presentation that walked through the tactical situation, the decision points, and the reasoning that led to not engaging the unknown aircraft. The room was packed, standing room only, with students and observers who'd heard about Revenant and wanted to see if the legend matched reality. She clicked through slides showing terrain, aircraft positions, and the moment when violence would have been easy and wrong. "The question isn't whether I could have engaged," she told them, standing beside a map that showed mountains she still saw in dreams. "I had weapons. I had authorization. I had a target-rich environment and every tactical justification." She paused, let that settle. "The question is whether engaging served the mission. 8 SEALs were completing an extraction that would save lives and provide intelligence. Unknown aircraft were providing security for that mission. My job wasn't to start fights. It was to bring my people home." A hand raised. Air Force Major, with the kind of precise bearing that suggested either academy graduate or someone who'd adopted the culture thoroughly. "But you didn't know that when you held fire. You made the call without complete information." Every combat decision is made without complete information. You work with what you have, apply judgment, and accept the consequences. Raina advanced the slide to show the thermal image of the SEALs loading, the children wrapped in blankets, the moment when everything that could have gone wrong didn't. "I had enough information to know that shooting would end communication. I chose to keep talking. That choice created space for better outcomes." The discussion that followed was exactly what she'd hoped for. Students arguing about risk assessment and rules of engagement and the moral calculus of violence. No easy consensus emerged, which was the point. These were officers who would face their own complicated nights. They needed to understand that complexity was normal, that uncertainty was constant, and that good judgment mattered more than quick reflexes. After the lecture, students approached with questions that ranged from tactical to philosophical. One Army captain, with combat patches from 2 deployments, asked the question that mattered most. "How do you live with the possibility that you might have been wrong? That holding fire could have gotten people killed?" Raina recognized the weight behind the question, the experience that prompted it. You accept that command means living with uncertainty. You make the best decision you can with the information available. You learn from outcomes. She met his eyes. "And you understand that second-guessing yourself into paralysis helps no one. Trust your training, apply judgment, and move forward. Even when it keeps you awake. Especially then, the decisions that haunt you are usually the important ones." She smiled without humor. "The day you stop questioning your choices is the day you've lost the capacity for growth. Stay uncomfortable, stay honest, and keep getting better." The course concluded with a graduation ceremony that featured speeches about excellence and leadership, and the importance of thinking warriors in an increasingly complex world. Raina sat through it with the patience of someone who'd endured countless military ceremonies and understood they served a purpose beyond entertainment. When the commandant called her to the stage for recognition, she accepted a plaque that would join the others and gave brief remarks about the quality of the students and the importance of the mission. The applause was genuine, which mattered more than the award. She flew home commercial, through Atlanta's chaotic airport and into Bozeman, where Montana waited with the patient indifference of landscape that predated human concerns. The drive back to her town took her through country that looked like memory, all rolling hills and distant mountains and sky that went forever. This was home in the way that mattered, the place that had formed her before the army refined the shape. Spring became summer, and with it came an invitation that surprised her. The Department of Defense wanted to establish a formal program teaching judgment-based decision-making to mid-career officers across all services. They wanted her to lead the curriculum development, working with a team of instructors to create something systematic and scalable. The position would be civilian, consulting rather than active duty, with autonomy to design the program according to her best judgment. It was the kind of offer that recognized expertise while providing the freedom to actually use it. Raina accepted because the mission mattered more than continued retirement. She spent the summer building frameworks for teaching what couldn't really be taught, finding ways to systematize judgment and create scenarios that forced students to confront their assumptions. The team she worked with included combat veterans from multiple services, academics who studied decision-making, and psychologists who understood how stress affected cognition. Together, they built something comprehensive, a program that used real operations as case studies while protecting classified information and individual privacy. The first pilot class ran at Quantico in October, drawing students from every service and several allied nations. Raina taught the opening week, setting the tone with lectures that combined tactical reality with philosophical complexity. She told them about nights in the Hindu Kush, days over Iraq, and missions that went right because someone made the hard choice at the critical moment. The students responded with engagement that suggested the material resonated. These were officers who'd seen combat, who understood that textbook answers rarely matched reality, and who wanted tools for navigating complexity. The program expanded over the following years, becoming a required course for officers being considered for battalion command and above. Thousands of students moved through the curriculum, learning frameworks for judgment that they'd carry forward into their own commands. Some would later write about how the course changed their approach to leadership. Others would make decisions in combat that reflected the principles taught. And occasionally, Raina would hear about situations where officers had chosen restraint over action, preventing escalation and preserving lives, and she'd feel the satisfaction of knowing the teaching had taken root. Recognition came in various forms: articles in military journals discussing the judgment program, invitations to speak at war colleges, a profile in a national magazine that made her uncomfortable with its focus on her rather than the mission. She declined most of the attention, preferring to focus on the work of teaching and refinement. But some recognition was impossible to avoid, particularly when the Chief of Staff of the Army personally called to thank her for contributions to professional military education. That conversation was brief and professional, and mattered more than any formal award. Years accumulated. Raina's hair went gray, then white, in the way that happened to people who'd spent decades under stress and decided to own it rather than fight it. She remained fit through stubborn insistence on daily runs and the kind of physical discipline that became identity rather than just habit. Her reputation evolved from that pilot to that officer to that instructor to something more fundamental: the person who demonstrated that thinking mattered more than shooting, and who'd built a legacy from that understanding. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning, unremarkable except in retrospect. Department of Defense, senior leadership, requesting her presence for a classified briefing at the Pentagon. No details beyond the request and the understanding that this was important. She flew to Washington, navigated security that had become increasingly paranoid, and found herself in a room with people whose ranks and positions suggested this was several levels above her normal sphere. A three-star general she'd met briefly years ago conducted the briefing with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times. "Colonel Marchenko, we have a situation that requires your specific expertise and judgment." The briefing detailed an operation in Yemen, or maybe it was Somalia. The geography mattered less than the moral complexity. A high-value target, a planned strike, and intelligence suggesting the target was protecting a group of civilians who would die in any attack. The planners were arguing about rules of engagement and acceptable collateral damage, and whether the strategic value justified the human cost. Someone had suggested they needed an outside perspective, someone with a history of making hard calls in impossible situations. They'd called Raina. She listened to the briefing, studied the intelligence, and asked questions that made some of the planners uncomfortable, about verification of the civilian presence, about alternative approaches, about whether the target's death was worth the cost in innocent lives and international credibility. The discussion lasted 4 hours, moving through tactics and strategy and ethics in ways that made clear there was no simple answer. When they finally turned to her for recommendations, she gave them the same advice she'd given students for years. You need better information before you commit to violence. Deploy assets to confirm the civilian presence. Explore alternatives that achieve the strategic goal without the collateral damage. And accept that sometimes the hard choice is waiting when action feels urgent. And if we wait and the target escapes, then you hunt him again, but you do it without the weight of dead civilians making every future operation harder. Raina stood, gathering her notes. "Gentlemen, I understand the pressure to act decisively, but decisive doesn't mean quick. It means making the choice that serves the mission beyond just the immediate tactical situation." They thanked her for her time and input. She flew home not knowing if they'd listen, but understanding she'd given them the best advice she could. Weeks later, she'd learned through informal channels that they'd deployed additional ISR assets, confirmed the civilian presence, and developed an alternative approach that captured the target without casualties. The operation was successful and never made the news, which was exactly how it should have worked. Raina felt the satisfaction of knowing her advice had mattered, that teaching and experience had translated into saved lives, and that the cycle of judgment she'd been promoting had achieved its purpose. The years continued their accumulation. Raina turned 60, then 65, marking time not by birthdays, but by cohorts of students and operations influenced and decisions improved. She remained active in the judgment program, teaching intensively during select periods and consulting remotely the rest of the time. Montana remained her home, the place she returned to between obligations, where sky and distance provided perspective that cities couldn't match. And occasionally, when weather permitted and the mood struck, she'd rent a small aircraft and fly over country she'd known since childhood, remembering when everything had been simple and ahead of her. There was an afternoon, late autumn with snow threatening but not yet committed, when she received visitors that clarified what legacy actually meant. A group of officers, ranging from captain to colonel, representing all services and multiple allied nations, arrived in her small Montana town with the express purpose of thanking her. They were graduates of her judgment program, officers who'd used the frameworks she'd taught to make decisions that had saved lives, prevented incidents, and demonstrated that intelligence mattered more than firepower. They gathered in her living room, cramped and awkward in the civilian setting, and took turns explaining how her teaching had changed their approach to leadership. An Air Force lieutenant colonel described a situation over Syria where he'd held fire despite authorization to engage, creating space for negotiation that had de-escalated a potential international incident. An Army major talked about choosing to evacuate civilians before conducting a raid, accepting tactical delay in service of strategic wisdom. A British officer discussed applying judgment frameworks to peacekeeping operations, emphasizing restraint and communication over force projection. Each story was different in detail but similar in principle. They'd chosen to think instead of simply react, and outcomes had improved because of it. Raina listened with the discomfort of someone who'd never sought recognition but understood its importance in this context. These officers had taken her teaching and made it real, applying abstract principles to concrete situations where lives hung in balance. "You're giving me too much credit," she said when they finished. "You made the decisions. You lived with the consequences. I just provided frameworks." "You provided permission," the Air Force officer corrected. "Permission to think that choosing not to shoot didn't make us weak, that judgment mattered more than speed, that the hard choice was sometimes the right one." He looked around the room at his peers. "We're here because your example changed how we lead. That deserves acknowledgement." The afternoon stretched into evening, conversation moving from professional to personal, from tactical stories to family updates, and the shared experience of military service. They ate dinner at the local restaurant, where the staff treated them with the confused hospitality reserved for unexpected groups of obvious military people in towns where such gatherings were unusual. And when the officers finally left, driving back toward the airport and their various assignments, Raina sat alone in her house and felt the weight of legacy settle with surprising comfort. She'd wanted to make a difference. Apparently, she had. The final chapter came unexpectedly, as important things often do. Raina received an invitation to speak at the Air Force Academy, addressing the graduating class about leadership and judgment and the lessons learned from a long career. She accepted because turning down such requests sent the wrong message about the importance of teaching. The trip to Colorado Springs brought her through landscapes she'd flown over decades ago, when everything had been new and uncertain and ahead of her. The academy hadn't changed much, still all sharp angles and dramatic architecture against mountains that made even institutional buildings feel insignificant. The graduation ceremony was enormous. Thousands of cadets and their families gathered to mark the transition from students to officers. Raina sat on the stage with dignitaries and senior leaders, feeling out of place in the way that came from having lived too much of life to be impressed by ceremony. But when her turn came to speak, she approached the podium with the understanding that some audiences deserved your best effort, and new officers fell into that category. She talked about judgment, about the difference between courage and recklessness, about the moral weight of command. She told them about a night in the Hindu Kush when not shooting had been harder than shooting, and how that choice had saved lives and prevented escalation. She explained that leadership wasn't about always having answers, but about asking the right questions and accepting complexity as normal rather than exceptional. And she finished with advice that felt both simple and essential. "You're about to receive tremendous authority and responsibility. Use it wisely. Think before you act. Value the lives entrusted to you. And remember that sometimes the hardest trigger to not pull is the most important one." The applause was polite and enthusiastic in the way graduation applause always was, a mix of relief and anticipation. But afterwards, as graduates and families mingled, several new officers sought her out with questions that suggested the message had resonated. They asked about decision-making frameworks and handling uncertainty and living with the weight of command. Raina answered each question with the honesty of someone who'd stopped pretending leadership was easy, offering tools and perspective rather than false reassurance. These conversations, she thought, mattered more than the formal speech. This was where teaching actually happened, in the messy exchange of experience between those who'd learned and those who were learning. The flight home gave her time to think about arc and purpose. She'd spent 40 years connected to military aviation, first as a pilot, then as a commander, finally as a teacher. The career had taken her to every continent, placed her in situations where split-second decisions carried life-or-death weight, and eventually evolved into something more cerebral but equally important. She'd flown when flying was necessary and taught when teaching mattered more. The transition had been gradual and inevitable, the natural progression of someone who understood that competence should be passed forward rather than hoarded. Montana welcomed her home with the indifference that made it comfortable. The seasons continued their rotation, summer into autumn into winter into spring, marking time in the way landscape does when human concerns are transient against geological persistence. Raina settled into a rhythm that felt like earned peace, teaching occasionally, consulting when requested, and spending the rest of her time reading, hiking, and engaging with community in ways that military service had rarely permitted. She was present at town council meetings, volunteering at the library, helping at the local high school with their aviation program. The work was unglamorous and important, the kind of contribution that didn't come with awards but built community. There were moments, usually at dawn or dusk when light did interesting things to landscape, when she'd think about the helicopter she'd flown and the missions she'd completed and the particular intensity of combat aviation. Those memories were complicated, mixing pride and grief, and the understanding that some experiences couldn't be communicated to people who hadn't shared them. She'd lost friends, made decisions that haunted her, and survived when others hadn't through combinations of skill and luck that defied clean explanation. The weight of that was permanent, but so was the satisfaction of having served with competence and honor. She'd made a difference. In the particular mathematics of military service, that was sufficient. The last flight came without ceremony or recognition, just another day when Raina decided to rent a small Cessna and fly over country she'd known since childhood. The weather was perfect, Montana autumn with visibility forever and air smooth as memory. She lifted off from the local airport, climbed to altitude where the world became pattern rather than detail, and flew south along valleys her grandmother had shown her decades ago. The aircraft responded with the simple reliability of machines built without pretense, and for an hour she was just a pilot again, connected to sky and earth through stick and rudder, and the ancient joy of flight. She thought about trajectory, about the girl who'd grown up in big sky country and decided the best view was from above, who joined the army because that's where the helicopters were, who deployed again and again because the mission mattered more than comfort, and who'd eventually learned that teaching was its own form of service. The career had been long and complicated and ultimately satisfying, full of hard choices and uncertain outcomes, and the particular fulfillment that came from knowing you'd given your best effort toward purposes larger than yourself. She'd been Revenant, the pilot who refused to stay dead, who brought aircraft home against odds and made decisions that saved lives. The call sign had been joke, then legend, then teaching tool, finally just part of identity so integrated she barely noticed it anymore. The landing was smooth, tires chirping on pavement with the satisfaction of one more safe return. Raina taxied to the ramp, shut down the engine, and completed the post-flight routine with hands that had performed these tasks thousands of times across hundreds of aircraft. The FBO operator, an old friend who'd grown up with her, commented that she flew like someone who knew what they were doing. She accepted the compliment with the brevity that came from Montana culture, where excess words were viewed with suspicion. They talked about weather and harvest and local news, the mundane conversation of people whose friendship didn't require constant maintenance. Then she drove home through landscape painted in autumn colors, satisfied with the flight and the life that had brought her back to where she started. The call sign lingered, passed among pilots who'd flown with her or learned from her or simply heard the stories. Revenant became shorthand for a particular approach to aviation, competent, aggressive when necessary, but always intelligent. New pilots learned about the night in the Hindu Kush when she'd chosen judgment over violence and saved everyone involved. The story evolved with each telling, details sharpening or softening depending on the lesson being taught, but the core remained constant. She'd made the hard choice, accepted the risk of being wrong, and demonstrated that thinking mattered more than shooting. That lesson rippled forward through cohorts of officers who carried it into their own commands, applying judgment frameworks to new situations where violence was easy and restraint was harder. Years from now, long after Raina had faded into the comfortable obscurity of retirement, young pilots would still hear about Revenant. They'd learn the call sign before the name, understand the legend before the person, and carry forward the principle that sometimes the most important shot was the one you didn't take. The legacy wasn't monuments or formal recognition, though both existed in modest form. The legacy was changed thinking, improved judgment, and lives saved through the application of intelligence over instinct. In the particular calculus of military service, where success was often measured in what didn't happen rather than what did, Raina Marchenko had achieved something remarkable. She'd made people think before they pulled triggers. She'd demonstrated that judgment mattered, and she'd created a framework that would continue teaching long after she was gone. The night stayed silent for hours that night in the Hindu Kush, wrapped in mountain darkness and the particular tension of operations that transcended simple categories. And when every SEAL returned, tired but standing, carrying children who would live because someone had chosen intelligence over violence, the silence broke into the sound of rotors and relief, and the understanding that some nights, the right choice looked wrong until you saw the whole picture. That night became legend, then teaching tool, then fundamental principle that shaped how a generation of officers approached command. And at the center of it all was a pilot who'd refused to die, refused to quit, and refused to accept that violence was the only answer. Her name was Revenant, and her legacy was judgment.